All right, today we're digging into a set of documents that present a really critical perspective on modern Zionism. They aim to trace its roots way back through history and theology, and the picture they paint is, well, pretty controversial. So right off the bat, the sources we're examining today pose this huge question. Is there a hidden theology pulling the strings in modern geopolitics? Their answer is a resounding yes. They argue that if you really want to understand what's happening today, you can't just look at the news. You have to go way back and look at the ancient texts they say form the true foundation. Let's get into the central argument, which one source actually titles a counterfeit kingdom. The main idea here is that modern Zionism is not, and I repeat, not a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. The argument is that it's something else entirely. And here's the core of it. The sources claim Zionism is a political movement, plain and simple. They call it a counterfeit foundation that's built on Talmudic tradition, not biblical scripture. This analysis suggests that this has created a massive case of mistaken identity, confusing a modern political state with the spiritual Israel of the Bible. So how in the world do they back that up? Well, they point us directly to the Talmud and other rabbinical writings. Specifically, they focus on the relationship these texts allegedly established between Jews and non-Jews, with a real emphasis on Christians. Okay, so these sources, including one called the Talmud Unmasked, really zero in on this term, akum. They say it's an acronym for worshippers of stars and planets, and that it was used in Talmudic texts to refer to Christians, basically classifying them as idolaters. This definition is presented as absolutely key to understanding the whole theological divide they're talking about. And to drive that point home, the sources offer up this quote from the famous medieval scholar Maimonides. And be it known that Christian people who follow Jesus are all worshippers of idols. This is presented as Exhibit A, direct evidence that from the specific theological viewpoint, Christianity was seen as idolatry. But it doesn't stop there. The source material also claims that the Talmud contains some really specific and hostile stories about the founder of Christianity. The allegations are that he's not even called by his name, but referred to as that man or the one who was hanged, that he's described as a seducer who used magic, and even that he was illegitimate and is now buried in hell. This alleged theological divide is then shown to spill over into everyday life, especially when it comes to business. The sources cite texts that they claim say, it is permitted to deceive a goy. If a Christian pays too much in error, the Jew may keep it all. This is put forward as proof of a different ethical standard being allowed for interactions with non-Jews. On top of that, the sources list a bunch of rules from rabbinic texts that they say were designed to enforce a really strict social and spiritual separation. We're talking about things like not being allowed to salute a Christian, seeing their festivals as days of calamity, and even a rule about not treating them medically unless refusing to do so would cause bigger problems. The overall theme presented is one of mandated avoidance, based on a view of Christians as unclean and shedders of blood. Okay, so now the argument shifts gears a bit. We're moving away from the legal texts of the Talmud and into the mystical world of Kabbalah. The sources we're looking at claim that this tradition also has non-biblical, maybe even pagan roots. This painting here of a theurgist kind of captures the vibe of what we're about to get into. According to these documents, Kabbalah has a really complex and debated origin story, one they argue has nothing to do with biblical tradition. So to make their case, the sources bring in this 19th century scholar, Adolf Frank, and he saw what he believed were direct parallels between Kabbalah and ancient Persian theology, also known as Zoroastrianism. For instance, you have concepts like the Ein Sof, or the infinite, being compared to the Persian Zerzane Akarin. Ideas like a threefold soul and a complex celestial hierarchy are also laid out as having really strong parallels. The conclusion drawn in these documents, that the core ideas of Kabbalah were actually imported from the theology of the ancient Persian Magi. Okay, so the sources take this whole alleged theological framework, and it connected directly to a pattern of historical events that repeated itself all across Europe. 1,030. That number is huge. According to these documents, that's how many separate times Jews were expelled from various kingdoms, cities, and territories throughout history. This figure is presented as a major piece of historical evidence for their argument. So what were the official reasons given? The sources point to decrees just like this one from England in 1275, called the Statute of the Jewry. It literally says, "For the honor of God and the common benefit of the people, no Jew shall lend anything at usury." The documents highlight these kinds of laws, which pointed to specific economic practices, like lending money at interest or usury, as the official justification for kicking people out. And this all builds up to the central question posed by the source material. Was this long, painful history of expulsion just random, irrational hatred? Or, and this is the alternative they propose, was it a recurring reaction from different countries to what they saw as a theology of supremacy and practices of economic subversion? And finally, the whole argument is brought crashing into the modern day with a section called the Zionist liability. This is where the focus shifts to the alleged geopolitical fallout of this history, specifically for the United States. One of the main sources, the Metanoia Minds dossier, lays out what it calls the geopolitical liability thesis. It claims Zionism acts like a global state, or all-Judean, using money and propaganda to get its way. It alleges that it's launched virulent attacks on Christian institutions right here in the US, and that it's compromising America's moral integrity and national security. But the heart of the argument is this: it demands allegiance to a state whose own foundational texts are, they claim, hostile to Christianity. This quote from that source document really sums up their entire conclusion. The United States is financing a counterfeit kingdom that stands in direct opposition to its own interests. So the argument presented is that this relationship isn't just a bad strategic move, but it's fundamentally damaging because it's built on what the sources call a theological lie. And so this is where we're left, with this final provocative question posed by the sources. Which Israel should be blessed? A spiritual kingdom or a geopolitical entity that, according to these very texts, rejects the Messiah? That's the challenge this analysis leaves with you, a call to really think about the difference between the political and the spiritual, based entirely on the arguments laid out in these documents.